Right. All right, so we're going to continue on with our little body mass calculator. Last week, we finally got our project running. We created a little text area here that we changed the size of our font and added an image. And we have our activity. This is the actual activity that each Java application, each Android application has to have at least one activity. And typically an activity corresponds to a page on your Android app. So if I put a go to next page, that next page would be a different activity. The activity manages everything on the screen in that area. And they also have this concept, which we might get to later, called fragments, which are smaller activities where you can have multiple fragments on a single screen, and each fragment is maintained by its own activity. So we have this whole activity class, which are just little programs that are laid out on the screen. So for every activity that we create, this method must be created. We have to have an onCreate method that overrides the activity's onCreate method, right? Because my activity is a subclass of activity because it extends activity. Remember that? Similar, that's the same thing as that in Ruby. My activity is a subclass of activity, right? So anybody know that actually read the book what this @override means here? I know that would require having a book and actually reading it, but this is not absolutely necessary. If I didn't have this, the project would still run. All right? The problem is that if we don't spell this right, let's say we call it onCreate, and we don't spell it right, then we're thinking we are overriding the activity class's onCreate method, when in fact all we're doing is adding our own new method called onCreate, which is spelled slightly differently. So the program will actually run, but you'll never see anything on the screen. And so you won't see any errors, and it won't show your layout on the screen when you run the project. So this is a kind of a compiler directive that says, I want to force this method here to be overriding a previous activities method. And here it says, it gives you an error now. And it will actually compile and show you that you're not actually overriding anything from your parent class. Okay? So that gives you, right now, during compile time, the error. All right? So now we know that this has got to be a capital C. And when I do that, now the override is satisfied, and it's just a good idea to do so that we don't run into those other issues. Does that make sense? It's a compiler directive to catch the errors sooner for us, basically. That's what that's for. All right? Use it liberally, right. Doesn't hurt to use it a lot. If you think you're overriding a parent's class, then make sure you use the override. Because we'll be writing other methods in here that don't override things. So, right. Right, use the override. All right, so it's just an error catcher for us. So let's start adding some additional features to our little project here. And we'll do that in our main.xml file. And remember that this has a design interface as well as a textual interface. I can click on the text tab down here below, and it shows me this is all that file is. It's just a text layout of XML, which looks like HTML, right? Similar thing. So when I add a new thing by dragging and dropping, it will change this file for me. So the design is where it's easiest. We can drag and drop just like C#. Isn't that cool? So let's add a label, a text view, and let's put it, and remember that as I'm dragging it, this little box shows up here. And I can't do it at the same time. It says center, left, fill parent, or right. So I'm going to make this a left-centered text box, and it shows me new text, and I can just double-click in there and modify this like enter your height in inches. And we can give it a specific ID similar to C#, and but we'll just leave it like that. So this is enter our height in inches. And then let's add a edit text, because we want them to be able to do that. Let's use the fill parent edit text, and that says fill all the way across the screen or across the container that it's in, which in this case is the screen. All right, and let's add another text view to the left, which says something like, enter your weight in pounds. All right, and then we need to have a way of entering their weight, so let's add a new edit text for fill parent again, and this will be my number of pounds that they enter. All right, everybody with me so far? So let's just play with these a little bit and see how we can get the data from these two text boxes, okay, without doing the whole calculation and things like that. So in our main program, we can start adding code. All right, so in order to access some of this information, we need some variables to get at that information. Okay, so we're going to add some private instance variables or properties up here so that we can store the data that we get back from those edit text boxes. All right, so the type of that is called an edit text, because that's what we added. If you look back at the XML, that is the style. It's called an edit text here. Everybody see that? Edit text is the class of this object that we're putting on the screen. So it's an edit text, and we'll call it whatever we want. I'm going to call it height in, because I'm getting data from that, and I'm going to have one called private that is of type edit text of weight in, just because that sounds good, right? Yeah, you could do comma, weight in, sure.
Just that.
Yes. That was an IntelliSense thing. Okay, so typically this onCreate then sets up everything we need to do to start up the application, right? So a lot of people, when they write these, they call their own little method. And I'm going to create one called Initialize app. And we'll create, that's where we're going to do all of our main setup code. So I can create my own new instance method here, my own method. It's not going to return anything. Call it Initialize app. And now when the create happens, it's going to call Initialize app, and here's where I'm going to do most of my code. That way, I could reuse this code on every new activity and just have to change this Initialize app method. Just a way of doing it. I could do all of this code up in here if I wanted to, but I think this is simpler. So in order to get the data, I have to have access to that view. Every object on the screen is a view. So I'm going to say my pounds in is, I'm going to assign that, and we have to typecast it. Edit text. And we call this method that's built into the Android development kit, find view by ID. And then we give it the R is the main layout for this application that's given to us, this R dot ID dot, and then the ID that we gave it on our screen over here, this in our main XML. So we called it, I don't know, probably not. Pounds in, it should be weight in, yeah. What did I have in here? Huh. Oh, I called it pounds in over here. So this is weight in. Yep, you're right. So we need to add this identifier. And so IntelliSense from IntelliJ comes back and says, which of these do you want? Well, I don't remember. It was edit text, or was it edit text 1? I don't know. So the problem is that we need to name these a little better, right? It's a better idea to name these something that are useful. So I'm going to change my edit text to be, that's this one, we'll call that one height. So we can change that down here in the ID and the properties of this. I can change that and call it weight. Is that what it was? No, this is height. Height. Height text. We'll call it height text. How about that? Or height input. That's even better. Call it whatever you want. But now let's change the other one. This one, this is the weight input. So we'll change that ID as well. Weight input. So now when I try to add these over here, it's going to make more sense. Okay, ID dot height input is going to be, I want the weight input for this guy. And I can copy and paste this, and this is going to be my height in now. And this is going to be dot height input. Okay, so what this does is it looks in the view for this specific ID and returns me a pointer, a link into that specific edit text. So now weight in is what type of an object? It's an edit text object, right? And an edit text object has different properties and methods and things we can do on that since it's an edit text, okay? All right, now there's also, before we get into calculations, it's also very useful to be able to print this out somewhere as the program is running. All right, so it's not going to work until I get my button in place. All right, so let's move on and add my button. So let's go back and add a button to my input here, so that we'll just drag a button over here and we'll center it, and we'll call this something like calculate BMI. And we'll change the ID to be calc BMI. And I know that Tom does this a lot. He prefixes these like this to show that it's a button class. Same thing in C#. So we could do that. We could make sure that the buttons all start with BTN, and then give it a name. That's kind of Hungarian notation, right?
Is that kind of standard with Java, though?
That's a personal thing, and yeah. A lot of these, you see on the tutorials, they don't even bother changing the IDs and things. But when you get to a large project, it would be painful, right? You'd have edit text 23. Now, which one was that again? You know, it's really tough to remember. So you're better off naming it something. All right. So we need to have this calculate BMI do something, right? We have to tie that into some code on my main activity. So there's like 4 ways to do that. I will show you one, and then I'll show you an easier way. Okay, so so let's do it one of the hard ways. There's actually 4, and the other 2 are even worse. So we need to have a variable to store my button. So we'll call it what type of data was that I added? What type is this guy? It's a button type, so we need to call our variable having a class of button, and we call it button calc BMI. All right? Oops. I lost my... All right, and it says I don't know where the button is, so I hit Alt-Enter, and it will import that button portion of the widget into my project so that it knows where all of the data it needs for that button class. Everybody got that? I needed to add the import for that particular code. All right, then in my Initialize app, I have to do a fair amount of code here. So I say, first of all, I have to get the ID that's in the view, and so we'll call it button calc BMI equals casting a button of a find view by ID r.id.button calc BMI. Okay, just like I did for the edit texts. Anybody with me there? Any questions so far? All right, that gets me access to the view so that I can play around with that button and do things with it. Then I have to tell my button there are different methods that I can run on this button. And one of them is called set onclick, oops, not called button, it's called btn calc BMI, dot set onclick listener, which is this one here. I need to set a method for this onclick listener so that when that button gets clicked, it executes this method that I'm going to create. So I have to tell it what is that going to be. So this is a lot like jQuery, where I have these anonymous functions, right? So I'm going to create a new method, onclick listener, and if I tab, it creates all of this code for me. IntelliJ did that for me. Isn't that sweet? And what this is telling it is doing what now again? This override. Right, we're overriding the parent's version of this onclick. Now this is now the code. Inside of here is what the code would run if the person clicked the button. All right? So I'm going to call this, I'm just going to call a method that I'm going to create later, calculate BMI, and we'll create that method down here to actually do something. So we just won't do anything here yet. All right, so that's one way to do it, and let's see what happens before I call the clicker. I mean, actually run it and click something. Let's go over this another time. We're setting the onclick listener for this particular button. We're basically saying when the person clicks that, run this onclick method, and that's going to run my calculate BMI method, which is all the code down here. All right? Complicated, yes? A little bit complicated. So let's, I want to introduce you now to logging a little bit. There's a system that the Android uses called logcat that logs everything that goes on in the Android. And it's a lot of stuff that goes on in this logcat file. So there are some built-in methods. If I look at, let's go find some code about Android logcat. All right, here's the logcat code, and it's that's a program that runs it. You can run that on the Android itself, but we have a tie-in with this IntelliJ. I'll show you. Now, where was the? I should have. See if we can find the code again. I should have. Reading and writing logs. Here we go. So this is the Android developer documentation, and there's this method called the log class that lets me write different data to this logcat log file that's kept for me. So if I want to just print some information, I do a log.i. This is the name of the class that's calling that, and it's used for filtering. So this is a very important piece right here. And then this is the data that I want to print out. I can print any string that I want in this log information. And here's a log debug. It's just a different level of logging that I can do. So let's do the log I. I can say log.i, and we'll say it's going to be my, let's call it calculate BMI, and we'll say button was pressed. All right, so it's saying here can't resolve the symbol. We can use the Alt-Enter again. Sorry, wrong Alt. Alt-Enter, and we want to import the class. And if we look up here now, we have imported this android.util.log class now so that we can execute that code. All right? So let's run this and see if we get this in the log file. This will take a while to run for the first time. Oh, you got to be kidding me. My Dave's tablet got destroyed. All right, so it finally ran, and if I click on this button, nothing will happen. But let's look for that log file. In IntelliJ, it gives us a place to do that. In the running here at the bottom, it has an Android box. Click on the Android, and we can see, look at all these messages going by. This is the logcat file. It's just sitting there, and it's throwing files left and right, right? So first of all, we want to say, I only want to look at info messages. All right, so that slows it down a little bit. And then I only want to look for what I created in my here called calculate BMI. All right, that slows it down a lot, right? So email has stopped. Well, that's fine. I'm not using email. So now if I click on my calculate, ta-da, look at that. The button was pressed. Is that sweet? I'm so happy. It worked. So every time I click on that, it's calling this onclick overview with a view, calling my calculate BMI, and all this is doing is saying the button was pressed, right? Printing it out to the log, right? So that's the logcat, and it depends on all of those different levels that I can have. It depends. If I said log.d, it would only show up in the debug version, all right? And this calculate BMI is a way of filtering that out even further, because you can see there are thousands of messages a minute, thousands. It's just crazy. All right?
Does that get stored in like a terminal?
Yeah, it gets stored on the Android, I believe.
Does it get wiped out?
I think so. I don't remember.
Like, that's all.
That's a good Google search thing. I think it, after a while, there's probably a certain limit that it keeps, like 2K of it or something, and then it just writes off the top.
That looks like quite a bit of data storing.
Yeah, it's a lot. All right. So we have a few minutes. Let's actually we don't, but I'm going to do it anyway. We have that's one way to do that. Let's change this now. I'm going to comment all of this out. And in the XML, the layout view, I can look at my button, and there's actually an onclick. So this is a lot like C#, right? I can say, okay, what method do I want to run when the onclick happens? And I'm going to call it my calculate BMI method. All right. So the problem is that my calculate BMI has to have the same property as this onclick here. So what is different between these two? View, right? I have to pass it the view. I have to accept on my side the view that this is coming from. All right? So now if I run this, it should work the same way. Let's clear my log, run my program. A lot faster when you have it actually running. Click on calculate BMI and bada boom, bada bing. Isn't that a lot faster? A lot easier to deal with, that button. The difference is that this is done programmatically versus in the view XML. And I don't remember what version of Android that started allowing that, but for our 4.3 this works fine. So I think that's the easier way to go. Any questions on that? All right, tomorrow we'll actually do some calculations and some more fun stuff with that. That's good enough for today.